The old county courthouse in Ohio carried with it the kind of solemn gravity that made every footstep echo longer than it should. Its marble floors were polished, though cracked in places from decades of heavy use. The high windows let in faint. Sunlight filtered through dust and old blinds, creating shadows that stretched across the walls like silent spectators. It was a place that seemed frozen in time, unchanged by the world outside, yet pulsing with the weight of decisions that could alter lives forever. On this particular morning, the courtroom was unusually crowded. Word had spread that the case scheduled for trial was unlike most. It wasn't just about theft or a fight in a bar. It was about a dangerous man who had terrified his neighbors, a man known for intimidation. Some whispered that he had connections to gangs in the next county over. Others said he had escaped justice for years by threatening anyone who dared to testify against him. He sat at the defense table now, wearing a suit that didn't fit quite right, smirking as if he already knew the outcome. His eyes scanned the room with a predator's calm, landing on each juror, then the witness stand, and finally the door as if calculating exits. At the prosecutor's table, two attorneys shuffled, papers nervously, reviewing their notes again and again. They had worked tirelessly to build a case strong enough to stand, but one truth haunted them. Without the key witness, without her courage, everything could crumble. And that knowledge seemed to embolden the defendant's smirk even more. The judge's bench loomed high above it all. Judge Arthur McKinley was known in the county as fair but strict, a man who rarely let emotions interfere with proceedings. His deep-set eyes missed little. Yet even he sensed the unusual heaviness in the room as he adjusted his glasses and scanned the packed gallery. Something about today felt different. Something about the whispers in the room unsettled him. But perhaps the strangest detail of all sat quietly beside the prosecution table. A German shepherd, his fur sleek and posture steady. His name was Ranger, a police service dog trained not only for enforcement, but also for comfort. He had been used in trials before, especially with children, to give courage where fear tried to overwhelm. Still, it wasn't common, and many spectators were curious why the dog was here today. A few whispered in hushed tones, "Why a dog? This isn't about drugs. Maybe the witness is a child? No, she's grown. I saw her picture." In the far back row, nearly hidden, sat a young mother and her daughter. The mother, Melissa, had come not as a witness, but as quiet support for a friend involved in the case. She kept her head down, her dark hair shielding her face, trying not to draw attention. Beside her sat her daughter, Emily, only 3 years old, with wide eyes that missed nothing. Emily clutched a stuffed bunny, its fur worn thin, its ears nearly threadbare from constant love. She swung her small legs beneath the bench, humming softly to herself as the serious adults around her shifted uncomfortably. Few noticed her. Most were focused on the tension brewing at the front. Yet it was that unnoticed presence, the child, that would come to define this day. When the bailiff called the court to order, the room straightened as one. Judge McKinley entered, his black robe swaying, and took his seat. The sound of the gavel echoed with a sharp crack that silenced even the whispers. The trial had begun. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, standing tall, though his voice betrayed a faint tremor. "Today you will hear testimony about intimidation, about fear, and about courage. This case is not just about crime. It is about justice for those too afraid to speak until now." His words were practiced, rehearsed, but they carried truth. Everyone knew the stakes. Everyone, except perhaps the little girl in the back row, who had leaned down to whisper to her bunny, as if sharing a secret. The defense, in contrast, oozed confidence. Their lead attorney, a man with slicked hair and a smile sharp as glass, stood smoothly. "Ladies and gentlemen, This case is built on fear, not facts. You will see that the so-called witnesses have no strength to stand here, no ability to face truth. Fear does not equal guilt." He paused, glancing deliberately at the prosecution table, then at the young woman seated nervously behind it, their key witness. The defendant leaned back, smirking again, as though savoring the discomfort his attorney stirred. The jurors shifted. Some frowned, some nodded, but the tension grew thicker with every second. The first hours passed with procedural matters, with introductions and evidence submissions. But beneath it all, everyone waited for the same moment, the testimony. The key witness would soon be called, and if she broke under pressure, if she faltered even slightly, the case might collapse. Melissa shifted uneasily in her seat in the back. She wasn't part of the trial, but her friend was. She knew what this testimony meant, and she could feel her friend's fear, even from across the room. She reached for Emily's hand, squeezing gently, though the little girl seemed far more fascinated by the dog at the front of the room than by anything else. Ranger sat calmly, his eyes alert, his body language steady, exuding quiet strength. Emily smiled, whispering again to her bunny, "Doggie's not scared." The judge called for a brief recess before the testimony began. Lawyers shuffled. Jurors whispered. The bailiff barked orders for order. And in the lull, something remarkable happened. Ranger, sensing unease, lifted his head and looked directly at the nervous witness. His tail tapped once against the floor, a small sound but unmistakable in the silence. The witness inhaled sharply, as though reminded she wasn't entirely alone. The courtroom, though, still felt like a pressure cooker. The defendant drummed his fingers on the table, the smirk never leaving his face. The prosecutors whispered urgently to one another, their papers rustling. And in the back row, Emily tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she said, her voice a little louder than a whisper. "Doggie's helping." A few heads turned toward her. Melissa hushed her quickly, cheeks flushing red. But the words had carried farther than she realized, and in a courtroom, weighed down by fear, that small, innocent observation floated in the air like light breaking through storm clouds. Most dismissed it in the moment. A child's chatter, nothing more. Yet for the witness who heard it, and for the officers nearby, it was like a spark. Innocence had spoken a truth no lawyer could argue. The dog wasn't just present, he was helping. The trial had only just begun, but the stage was already shifting. No one realized yet how pivotal that child's presence would be. But in that old courthouse with its cracked marble and heavy shadows, something extraordinary was stirring. And as the judge called the court back into session, the room seemed subtly, strangely different, as if courage had found a tiny foothold, waiting to grow. The courtroom quieted again as the judge returned from recess. The gavel struck once, sharp and commanding. "We will now proceed," Judge McKinley said, his voice steady but heavy with expectation. All eyes turned toward the prosecution's table, where a young woman sat hunched forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her chair. Her name was Sarah, 24 years old, with hair pulled back into a messy bun. She looked like anyone else you might see in town, a cashier, a student, a neighbor. But today she was more than that. She was the one person who had agreed to testify against the defendant, and she knew better than anyone else what he was capable of. When the bailiff called her name, Sarah's legs felt like stone. She stood, but her knees wavered beneath her, as if each step toward the witness stand carried the weight of 1,000 fears. She could feel the defendant's eyes burning into her back. She didn't need to look to know his expression. She had seen it many times before. That smirk, the one that promised she would regret every word she spoke. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as she was sworn in. Sarah's voice cracked slightly as she said, "I do." Her palms were slick with sweat, and she wiped them discreetly against her skirt before sitting down. The prosecutor gave her a small nod, encouraging, but she barely noticed. The only thing she noticed was him. The defendant leaned back casually. In his chair, eyes locked on her, the corners of his mouth curled into that same mocking grin. He wasn't worried. He didn't believe she would hold up. And if she faltered, if she failed, the jury would see weakness, and the case would crumble. The prosecutor began gently. "Sarah, could you please state for the court how you know?" "The defendant?" Her mouth went dry. She opened it to answer, but no sound came. For a long moment, the only thing in the room was silence. She glanced at the jury, rows of strangers staring expectantly at her, waiting for truth. Her chest tightened, her throat closed. She tried, her voice barely above a whisper. Then nothing. The defense attorney shifted smugly in his seat, folding his arms as if to say, "See, she can't even speak." A few jurors frowned, some tilting their heads sympathetically, others impatient. The judge raised an eyebrow, watching closely, but did not intervene yet. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Take your time," he said softly. "You're safe here. Safe." The word rattled inside her mind. Was she safe? Could anyone promise that? Sarah's heart hammered so loudly, she was certain the jury could hear it. Images flashed unbidden in her mind. Nights when she'd heard his voice outside her apartment, threatening phone calls that came at 2 a.m, shadows at her window. And worse, the way he had looked at her once, his face inches from hers, whispering that if she ever opened her mouth, she would never make it home alive. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She lowered her eyes to the table before her, staring at the microphone, the wood grain, anything but the defendant. Her lips parted again, but fear strangled her words before they could form. The defense attorney rose smoothly. "Your Honor," he said, his tone mocking restraint, "it seems the witness is struggling. Perhaps she's not prepared to testify today." Sarah flinched at the words. She knew what he was doing, trying to paint her as unreliable, weak, unworthy of belief. And it was working. She could feel the courtroom's energy shifting, could sense the jury's uncertainty. The prosecutor objected, his voice firmer now. "Your Honor, the witness is under extreme stress. This is precisely why accommodations were made." As if on cue, the German Shepherd Ranger lifted his head again. He had been sitting quietly by the prosecutor's table, his calm presence barely noticed by many until now. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. His nails clicked softly against the floor as he padded toward the witness stand. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A dog walking freely in a courtroom was unusual, even controversial. The defense attorney objected. Immediately, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular." Judge McKinley raised a hand, silencing him. His eyes studied the dog, then the trembling witness. "Overruled," he said after a pause. "The court has allowed the presence of the service dog. If it provides comfort to the witness, it may remain." Sarah looked down as Ranger reached her side. The dog sat, perfectly still, his brown eyes locked on hers. She felt his warmth beside her, his steady breathing, the quiet strength radiating from him. Tentatively, almost without realizing, her hand reached down. Her fingers brushed his fur. The softness grounded her in a way nothing else had. The courtroom held its breath. For a moment, it seemed as though things might shift. Sarah inhaled deeply, her trembling slowing just slightly. The prosecutor gave her another encouraging nod, silently urging her to continue. But then, from the defense table, the defendant let out a quiet chuckle. Not loud enough for the judge to scold him, but loud enough for Sarah to hear. Loud enough for her to know that he still believed he had her trapped. Her confidence wavered again. She looked down, shame rising in her chest, convinced she couldn't do it. She couldn't find her voice, not with him staring at her, not with that smirk. Her silence stretched on painfully, each second heavier than the last. The jury shifted. Uncomfortably. The prosecutor frowned, his jaw tightening. The defense attorney smirked triumphantly. The trial teetered on the edge of collapse. And then, from the back of the courtroom, a small voice rang out. "He's a good doggy." Heads turned instantly. There, standing on the bench with her stuffed bunny clutched tightly, was Emily. Her voice was clear, innocent, and completely out of place in the tension-filled room. Yet somehow, it cut through the fear like sunlight piercing storm clouds. Sarah's eyes widened. She turned slightly, catching sight of the little girl who had spoken. Emily wasn't afraid. She wasn't weighed down by threats or intimidation. She saw only the dog, and she saw goodness. She spoke it out loud, with the kind of honesty only a child could carry. The courtroom, for a moment, was utterly silent. No one knew how to react. The judge's lips parted, as though ready to reprimand, but the words didn't come. The jurors exchanged glances, softening. Even the prosecutor blinked, momentarily stunned. But for Sarah, it was everything. Something in her chest loosened. The little girl's words echoed in her mind. He's a good doggy, simple, pure, true. And if that was true, if Ranger was good, if he was here to help, then maybe she didn't have to be afraid anymore. Maybe she wasn't alone. Her trembling slowed. Her hand pressed more firmly into Ranger's fur, grounding herself. She lifted her eyes, not at the defendant, but at the prosecutor. "I know him," she said suddenly, her voice small but audible. The courtroom leaned in. "I know him," she repeated, louder this time. "He came to my apartment. He threatened me. He told me," her voice shook, but she didn't stop. "He told me if I spoke, I'd never see my family again." Gasps rippled again through the gallery. The defense attorney shot to his feet, objecting loudly, but the judge waved him down. The silence had been broken, and it was broken by the courage sparked not by arguments, not by evidence, not even by the judge, but by the innocent voice of a 3-year-old girl who had seen only a dog and named his goodness. The trial had shifted. Fear was no longer the only force in the room. Something stronger had entered. The tension that had gripped the courtroom was unlike anything most people there had ever felt. Sarah's first words had broken the silence, her voice shaking but real. The jury leaned forward now, more attentive, as if one fragile thread of courage had pulled them closer. But beneath it all, the atmosphere still trembled with fragility. Sarah could collapse at any moment, and the defense attorney knew it. He sharpened his expression, preparing to unravel her fragile composure with cross-examination when his turn came. The German shepherd, Ranger, remained planted at her side, steady as stone. He didn't bark, didn't move erratically. He simply breathed, his presence radiating reassurance. The witness's trembling hands stroked his fur, as though drawing strength from each soft strand. For the first time since she'd walked into the courtroom, Sarah's breaths began to steady. Then came the moment that would change everything. Emily, the 3-year-old girl at the back of the courtroom, had already broken the hush once with her innocent declaration. "He's a good doggy." Now, while her mother tried to hush her gently, Emily stood a little taller on the bench. Her small fingers wrapped around the warm ear of her stuffed bunny. Her eyes, impossibly wide and clear, were fixed on the police dog at the front. The courtroom waited for Sarah to continue. Instead, it was Emily who spoke again. "Don't be scared," she said softly, but the silence carried her words farther than she intended. Her child's voice, filled with unshaken certainty, drifted across the polished wood and marble like music. He helps. Dozens of heads turned toward her. The defense attorney opened his mouth to object again, but even he hesitated. What objection could one raise against a child's innocence? The judge frowned for a moment, about to restore order, but something in his eyes betrayed that even he was moved. Sarah's gaze fell on the child. Her throat tightened, but not from fear this time. She saw a little girl with no reason to be brave, and yet she was. Emily wasn't caught in intimidation or memories of threats. She didn't see jurors or lawyers or the smirking man at the defense table. She saw only the dog-kind, steady, trustworthy. And she trusted that truth so deeply she was willing to say it out loud. Sarah's chest rose and fell with a deeper breath. The hand resting on Ranger's back steadied. She turned her face toward the judge, then toward the prosecutor. "I can do this," she whispered almost to herself, but the microphone caught the words, and the jury heard them. The prosecutor leaned forward, seizing the fragile opportunity. "Sarah, you're safe," he said again, his voice firm but gentle. "Can you tell the jury what happened that night?" The defendant shifted in his chair, the smirk faltering slightly. He sat forward, as if trying to will her silence back into existence. But the spell was broken now. The child's words, so simple, had shifted the ground beneath him. Sarah lifted her chin. She still trembled, but her eyes no longer darted away from the jurors. "That night, he came to my apartment," she began, voice shaky but audible. "He pounded on my door until I opened it. When I did, She paused, her body trembling again, but Ranger pressed his head lightly against her hand. Emily's eyes widened at the dog's movement. She whispered again, "See, he helps." The victim's eyes filled with tears, but she kept going. "He leaned close to me and told me I would regret it if I talked to the police. He said he knew where my family lived. He said he'd come back." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop this time. The jury froze in rapt attention. The prosecutor gave her a small nod, urging her on. The defense attorney tried to object again, his tone sharp. "Objection, Your Honor, hearsay and prejudicial." The judge lifted a hand. Overruled. The witness may continue. For the first time, the defendant's smirk broke completely. His jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his glare fixed like daggers at Sarah. But she didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Ranger was beside her. And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a little girl who barely understood what trials were had spoken words strong enough to steady her. The jury began to shift again, but not in doubt this time. They leaned closer, some nodding slightly, as though they were willing her to keep speaking. The atmosphere had changed. What had been suffocating fear was now something else, hope, fragile but real. Sarah continued, each word giving her more strength. "I didn't want to come here," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't want to be in this room. But I couldn't let him keep doing this. Someone had to speak." Her voice grew firmer, her eyes locking on the prosecutor. "I'm speaking now." The courtroom erupted softly, murmurs breaking out among the gallery. The judge banged his gavel. "Order!" He barked, but there was no mistaking the change. Everyone felt it. In the back row, Melissa pulled her daughter gently into her arms, whispering for her to stay quiet now. But Emily only giggled softly and pointed toward the front. "Doggie's helping," she said again, this time to her mother alone. Melissa pressed her forehead against her daughter's hair, fighting tears of her own. She had come here, too. Support a friend, but she had not expected her child to become part of the trial itself. She could feel the ripple spreading through the courtroom, and deep down she knew this was no ordinary day. The defense attorney scowled, realizing the battle was slipping from his hands. His client leaned toward him angrily, whispering demands. But there was little to be done. The witness had found her footing. And worse for them, the jury had witnessed the transformation. They had seen a terrified young woman draw strength not from the attorneys or even the judge, but from a child. And a dog. It was a moment none of them would forget. For Sarah, it wasn't about legal arguments anymore. It was about survival, about truth. She could feel the weight of years lifting as she spoke. Each word was a risk, yes, but each word also chipped away at the fear that had chained her for so long. The defendant sat in silence now, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. His smirk was gone, and in its place, courage filled the room. Not loud, not grand, but undeniable. By the time the prosecutor finished his first round of questioning, Sarah was no longer trembling. Her voice had grown steadier, her words sharper. She looked less like a victim and more like a survivor. The jurors saw it. The judge saw it. And so did the defense attorney, who now flipped nervously through his notes, preparing for a cross-examination he no longer felt confident about. But perhaps the most remarkable part of all was how it had begun not with legal skill or force, but with a child's soft voice declaring the truth. "He's a good doggy. Don't be scared. He helps." The courtroom had witnessed more than testimony. They had witnessed connection, the kind that doesn't need arguments or evidence, only honesty. It was the silent connection between a terrified woman, a loyal dog, and a 3-year-old who dared to speak. And that connection was stronger than fear. The courtroom had been transformed. Where there had once been a suffocating silence, there was now the faint hum of whispers, the shifting of chairs, the stirrings of something stronger than fear. The defendant's smirk had vanished, replaced with the tight-lipped anger of a man who suddenly realized control was slipping through his fingers. Sarah, who only moments ago had been trembling on the witness stand, now sat taller, her voice firmer, her hand resting calmly on the German shepherd's back. But the true source of the shift was not the witness, nor the dog alone. It was a 3-year-old girl named Emily, seated in the back row with her stuffed bunny pressed against her chest. Her innocent words, "He's a good doggy. Don't be scared. He helps," had rippled through the courtroom like light breaking through storm clouds. Melissa, her mother, sat stiffly beside her, trying to keep her daughter quiet now, fearful of drawing the court's reprimand. But there was no containing Emily's wide-eyed fascination. She had watched the dog closely, seen the way he pressed himself against Sarah's trembling hand, and she had known instinctively what adults had forgotten. Kindness and courage often speak louder than intimidation. The judge cleared his throat, ready to move proceedings forward. The jury leaned back slightly, their expressions softened but curious. The prosecutor turned to gather his next set of notes. But before any of them could speak, Emily squirmed out of her mother's grasp. "Emily," Melissa whispered sharply, grabbing for her daughter's arm. But the little girl had already slid off the wooden bench, her small shoes clicking softly against the floor. A ripple of shock spread through the gallery as Emily began walking down the aisle, tiny, determined steps that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed courtroom. "Excuse me, bailiff," the judge began, half rising from his chair. The bailiff stepped forward uncertainly, but Emily moved with the confidence of someone who had never known fear of authority. She clutched her bunny in one hand, her eyes locked on Ranger at the front of the room. Gasps whispered through the audience. Some jurors raised eyebrows. Others smiled faintly, despite themselves. Even the prosecutor froze, papers in hand, unsure of what to do. Melissa rushed to the aisle, her voice desperate but hushed. "Emily, honey, come back." "You can't." But Emily ignored her mother completely. She walked straight toward Ranger, the German shepherd who had become the unspoken anchor of the trial. The dog tilted his head slightly as she approached, his tail wagging once in recognition. Sarah looked down, startled, as the child stopped right beside her chair. Emily knelt, unafraid, and placed her small hand on Ranger's back. The dog responded instantly, leaning slightly into her touch. The courtroom froze. The judge sighed, removing his glasses. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath, though his tone was more bemused than angry. Emily looked up, her voice ringing clear in the silence. "Don't be scared," she said, not to the dog this time, but to Sarah herself. "He helps. He's brave. You can be brave too." The words were simple, childlike, yet their weight filled every corner of the courtroom. Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears. For months she had carried the crushing fear of testifying, convinced she would break beneath the defendant's threats. She had leaned on Ranger for comfort, but now, looking into the unguarded sincerity of a child's face, something inside her shifted permanently. If this tiny girl could walk into the center of a courtroom without fear, what excuse did she have left? The jury leaned forward, their expressions changing. Even the judge, who had lifted his gavel to restore order, let it hover mid-air, then slowly lowered it again. He cleared his throat, but said nothing. The defense attorney shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, this is highly improper. We cannot have children influencing testimony or jury perception. This entire proceeding is becoming a circus." The judge turned his gaze toward the defense attorney, his expression cool. "Sit down, counselor. The bailiff will restore order in due course. But sit down." The authority in the judge's tone silenced him immediately. Meanwhile, Emily had placed her stuffed bunny on the witness stand, as though it too needed to be part of the moment. She looked up at Sarah again, her eyes wide. "See? Bunny's not scared either. You can talk." Sarah laughed through her tears, the sound trembling but real. She nodded, clutching the microphone. "Thank you," she whispered, her words meant only for the child, though the courtroom microphones carried them for all to hear. The prosecutor, regaining his footing, leaned forward quickly. "Sarah, if you're ready, could you please continue your testimony?" Sarah inhaled deeply. She nodded firmly. "Yes, I can." Emily smiled, satisfied, and sat cross-legged on the floor beside Ranger. She stroked his fur with one hand and hugged her bunny with the other, oblivious to the spectacle she had created. For her, this wasn't about law or verdicts. It was about helping. The courtroom, however, had been transformed again. What had once been fragile courage was now unshakable resolve. Jurors exchanged glances, their faces soft with something rarely seen in such a room admiration. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing a story that would be remembered for years. Even the hardened officers standing guard near the walls shifted slightly, their expressions gentler than before. Only one man in the room remained unmoved, the defendant. His jaw clenched tightly, his fists gripping the edge of the table. His smirk was gone entirely now, replaced by a scowl of disbelief. A child had stolen his power. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering furiously. But nothing he could say mattered anymore, for the jury had seen it. The witness was no longer a trembling victim. She was someone who had been reminded of her own strength by the most unlikely of figures. A 3-year-old girl and a dog. The prosecutor asked his next question, and Sarah answered with new confidence. Her words no longer cracked. Her eyes no longer darted to the defendant. She told her story with clarity, courage rising with every sentence. And through it all, Emily sat quietly on the floor, petting Ranger, her bunny perched on her lap. She didn't realize she had changed everything. She was just doing what felt right, speaking truth in the simplest, most innocent way possible. The judge finally leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Bailiff, Please escort the child back to her seat. The bailiff stepped carefully toward Emily, but she stood on her own, picking up her bunny and smiling at Sarah one last time. "You're brave now," she said softly. Then she turned and walked back down the aisle, her tiny footsteps echoing once again in the heavy silence. Melissa scooped her into her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks. She kissed her daughter's hair, whispering, "Oh, Emily, you don't even know what you've done." But everyone else knew. The jury knew. The attorneys knew. Even the judge, though he said nothing, knew. The balance of the trial had shifted forever, and it had done so in a way no legal strategy ever could. The child had stepped forward, and with her, so had truth. The hush that followed Emily's return to her seat was unlike any silence the courtroom had ever known. It wasn't the tense, suffocating quiet that had hovered over the proceedings before. This was different. It was charged with something invisible, something almost tangible. Hope. The jury leaned forward now, no longer detached spectators, but deeply engaged listeners. The prosecutor saw it immediately, the shift in their eyes, the way their pens rested still against their notepads. They were no longer watching a victim struggle through fear. They were watching courage grow in real time. Sarah, still seated at the witness stand, felt the change most of all. Just moments ago, her voice had trembled. Her body had stiffened under the weight of the defendant's gaze. Now, with Ranger by her side, and the memory of Emily's words echoing in her ears, "Can be brave too," her fear loosened its grip. Her hands no longer shook as she gripped the microphone. The prosecutor straightened his tie, choosing his next question carefully. His voice was calm, deliberate, steady enough to carry Sarah forward, but respectful enough not to push her too fast. "Sarah," he said, "can you tell the jury what happened that night, in your own words?" A small nod. Then another deep breath. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, summoning the strength she hadn't believed she had. When she opened them again, her gaze no longer flicked toward the defendant. Instead, she looked at the jurors directly, her voice trembling only at the edges. "It was late. I had just come home from work. I remember thinking it was strange, the way the front door felt heavier when I opened it, like it had been touched." She paused, her throat tightening. Ranger shifted closer to her leg, grounding her. "And then I saw him," she continued, her voice sharper now, cutting through the heavy air. "He was standing in my living room, waiting. He wasn't supposed to be there. I never let him in. He broke in." The jury stiffened. The defendant scowled, whispering furiously to his lawyer, who scribbled notes with a frantic hand. Sarah pressed on. "He grabbed me. I tried to scream, but he covered my mouth. He said if I told anyone, if I ever spoke, he would hurt me worse. And I believed him. For months, I believed him." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. She leaned forward, clutching the microphone, as though her words could not be restrained any longer. "But I can't stay silent anymore. He can't scare me into silence." Her declaration sent a ripple through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled, their pens nearly tearing paper. Jurors exchanged looks of disbelief, then sympathy. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying a flicker of approval. The prosecutor nodded gently, his voice steady. "And is that man the one who threatened you in this courtroom today?" Sarah's eyes flicked toward the defense table for only a moment, then returned firmly to the jury. "Yes, he's right there." She raised her hand, pointing directly at the defendant. The man stiffened, jaw clenched so tight a vein bulged at his temple. "Let the record reflect," the prosecutor said, "that the witness has identified the defendant." The defense attorney shot up instantly. "Objection. Leading testimony, emotionally charged environment. This entire courtroom has been compromised by a child's disruption. His words came out in a rush, his voice cracking with desperation. The judge raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Counselor, sit down. Your objection is noted and overruled. The testimony stands." The defense attorney collapsed back into his chair, muttering under his breath. Melissa, seated with Emily at the back, held her daughter tightly. She could feel her own heart racing, stunned at how quickly the room had shifted. Emily, however, remained blissfully unaware of the chaos she had caused. She stroked her stuffed bunny absent-mindedly, eyes still fixed on Ranger. To her, the dog had done most of the work. She had only reminded the adults not to be afraid. Sarah's testimony grew stronger with every answer. Each sentence seemed to shed another layer of fear, each detail sharper than the last. She described the night in vivid detail, the forced door, the struggle, the threats whispered in the dark. The jurors listened intently, nodding at moments that resonated, their sympathy deepening into resolve. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his attorney tugging at his sleeve, trying to regain composure. But it was too late. The image had already been burned into the jury's minds. Sarah, once trembling, now unshakable, empowered by a child's voice and a dog's steady presence. When Sarah finally finished her testimony, her shoulders sagged in exhaustion, but her eyes were brighter. The prosecutor nodded respectfully. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge turned. "Cross-examination?" The defense attorney rose reluctantly, straightening his suit jacket. He tried to inject confidence into his voice, but the strain was obvious. He paced deliberately, hoping to regain some control. "Sarah," he began, "isn't it true that you were under a great deal of stress that evening? That perhaps your memory of events could be unreliable?" Sarah didn't flinch. She met his gaze squarely. "No, I remember everything. Fear doesn't erase memory. It carves it deeper." The courtroom gasped softly. Even a few jurors nodded in agreement. The defense attorney faltered, his words caught in his throat. He scrambled for another angle. "And isn't it also true that—" But Sarah cut him off with a calm certainty that silenced him completely. "You can try to twist this however you want. But the truth is the truth. And I'm not afraid to say it anymore." The prosecutor leaned back, satisfied. The judge raised an eyebrow at the defense attorney, who stammered, then retreated to his seat. "No further questions," he muttered. The judge looked down at Sarah. "You may step down." As Sarah left the witness stand, she reached down to pat Ranger one last time. The dog wagged his tail gently, his mission accomplished. She walked past the jury, past the defendant, her step steady, her chin lifted. For the first time since the trial began, she felt free. The jury's eyes followed her until she took her seat. Some wrote notes, others simply sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what they had witnessed. The courtroom itself seemed transformed, less a sterile chamber of law, more a stage where truth had been laid bare. And at the center of it all was the echo of a child's innocent words, words that had cracked open a space for courage to flourish. Melissa hugged Emily tightly, whispering, "Sweetheart, you don't even know what you've done." But Emily only giggled, pressing her bunny's ears to her lips. "I just told the truth," she said softly. And the truth, now, had taken root. The rest of the trial still lay ahead, the closing arguments, the jury's deliberation, the final verdict. But no one in that courtroom doubted anymore that something extraordinary had happened that day. The balance of fear and power had shifted, not because of legal arguments or evidence alone, but because a 3-year-old girl reminded everyone what courage looked like in its purest form. The transformation was irreversible. And the defendant, once so sure of his intimidation, now sat hunched in his chair, glaring at the child who had undone him without even realizing it. The courthouse clock ticked past noon. its chimes faintly echoing through the walls as the trial resumed after a short recess. Outside the building, life continued with the rhythm of traffic and distant voices. But inside, the atmosphere was charged, every breath held in anticipation. What had begun as a routine criminal case now felt like something far greater. A test of courage, truth, and the fragile balance of justice. Sarah's testimony lingered like a storm cloud, powerful, undeniable, and deeply moving. The jurors, still visibly shaken, carried her words in their expressions. Some looked pale, others stern, but all of them looked focused. The prosecutor sat confidently at his table, his files neatly stacked, his notes highlighted in careful order. He knew momentum was on his side. Yet, in his experience, trials rarely ended without turbulence. The defense would not go quietly. And indeed, the defendant's attorney emerged from recess with renewed energy, his movements sharper, his voice pitched with urgency. He whispered heatedly with his client, who sat scowling, fists clenched tight against the table. The man's eyes flickered between Sarah, Emily, and the jurors, seething with a venom he could no longer disguise. The judge entered promptly, robes flowing, and took his seat. "Court is back in session," he announced firmly, bringing down the gavel once. The defense attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, the defense moves for a mistrial." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the jury stiffened, pens poised mid-air. The judge raised his eyebrows. "On what grounds?" The attorney's voice rang out, desperate but bold. "On the grounds that this trial has been irreparably compromised by outside influence. Specifically, the courtroom disruption caused by a child who was allowed to interact with the witness during testimony. That moment, as moving as it may have seemed, has tainted the jury beyond repair. We cannot proceed in fairness." He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air. Then he added, "Your Honor, the defense contends that the emotional spectacle staged in this courtroom has rendered impartial judgment impossible." Melissa's heart clenched. She gripped Emily's hand protectively, furious at the implication. Emily sat swinging her little legs, blissfully unaware of the storm her innocent act had unleashed. The prosecutor rose calmly, his face controlled, though his jaw tightened. "Your Honor, the defense is mischaracterizing what occurred. A child spoke a few words of encouragement, unscripted, spontaneous, pure. It was not a spectacle. It was humanity. And while it was touching, the testimony we heard afterward was clear, credible, and rooted in fact. This jury is more than capable of distinguishing between emotion and evidence." The judge considered both sides, his gavel tapping lightly against the bench as though keeping time with his thoughts. The silence stretched long, each second a lifetime. Finally, he spoke, motion denied. "The testimony stands. This court will not disregard truth simply because it was accompanied by courage." The defense attorney's face flushed crimson. He leaned toward his client, whispering furiously. The defendant's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes narrowing. At the judge, then at Sarah. He tapped his fingers against the table, a rhythm of frustration and menace. The prosecution resumed, calling a forensic specialist to the stand. Evidence was presented. Fingerprints from the doorframe, matching shoe prints outside Sarah's home, phone records placing the defendant near her residence on the night in question. Each piece layered over the last like bricks, building an unshakable wall around the truth. The jurors scribbled furiously, heads nodding. The picture grew clearer. This was no case of mistaken memory. This was deliberate, planned, undeniable. But the defense wasn't finished. When it was their turn, they shifted strategies. Instead of directly attacking the forensic evidence, the attorney leaned heavily into character assassination. He called former acquaintances of Sarah, dragging them to the witness stand. each attempt crafted to paint her as unreliable, unstable, untrustworthy. She's exaggerating. She was emotional, even dramatic at times. She once told me she didn't feel safe walking alone, even when no one was following her. The statements dripped with implication, but none held substance. They were fragments, twisted anecdotes, shadows trying to obscure the sun. Sarah sat quietly through it all, her hands folded in her lap. Each accusation stung, but her newfound courage steadied her. Ranger sat close by, his calm presence shielding her from despair. And the jurors, perceptive and attentive, seemed unconvinced by the defense's parade of half-truths. Still, the courtroom felt heavier, the mood darker. Melissa sensed the shift and held Emily closer. "Why are they saying mean things about the lady?" Emily whispered. "Because they don't have anything true to say," Melissa whispered back. Emily frowned, her little brow furrowing in thought. "That's not fair." The tension mounted further when the defense attorney called the defendant himself to the stand. It was a gamble, but desperation made bold men reckless. The man walked with forced confidence, straightening his suit jacket, his jaw set as though he could will himself into innocence. Taking his seat, he scanned the jury with eyes that tried to soften, but there was something predatory beneath the surface. His attorney guided him with gentle, rehearsed questions. "Did you break into Sarah's home that night?" "No," the man said firmly. "Did you threaten her in any way?" "Absolutely not. I loved her. She misunderstood everything." The words hung heavy, but they rang hollow. "Why do you think she would say these things about you?" "She's confused. Maybe she's bitter. Maybe she doesn't remember right." He leaned forward, voice lowering. "But I would never hurt her. Never." Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Others frowned. His words were polished, but his eyes betrayed something else. The prosecutor rose slowly, his gaze steady. "Mr. Thompson, you claim you never threatened Sarah, and yet multiple witnesses heard you say to her, 'If you speak, you'll regret it.' Did you not say those words?" The man's face twitched. "Taken out of context," he muttered. "Taken out of context?" The prosecutor repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Tell us, in what context does that phrase mean anything other than a threat?" The defendant stammered, sweat gathering at his brow. It was an argument, that's all. People say things." The prosecutor pressed forward, relentless. "And what about the fingerprints? The shoe prints? The phone records? Were those just misunderstandings too?" The man's jaw clenched, silence swallowing him whole. The prosecutor turned to the jury, his voice calm but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the testimony. You've seen the evidence. You've heard his excuses. Ask yourselves, do they sound like truth or desperation?" The defense attorney objected, but the judge allowed the statement, overruling swiftly. The jurors sat still, their expressions solemn. Some scribbled notes furiously. Others simply stared at the defendant, their skepticism now palpable. By the time the man stepped down from the witness stand, his composure had cracked. His shoulders sagged, his movements jerky, his mask of innocence slipping beyond repair. The courtroom exhaled collectively, the balance tipping ever further. The prosecutor's case was strong, but it was Emily's earlier words, Sarah's bravery, and the defendant's own unraveling that now carried the greatest weight. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, the judge dismissed the jury with instructions not to discuss the case until deliberations began. They filed out quietly, their faces etched with thought, their silence more powerful than words. The gallery emptied slowly, reporters rushing to draft headlines. Melissa gathered Emily's things, whispering encouragement to her daughter, who still didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what she had done. Sarah approached them quietly, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She knelt beside Emily, voice soft. "You gave me strength today. I'll never forget that." Emily hugged her tightly, whispering into her ear, "You are brave too." The weight of those words carried Sarah forward as she walked out into the evening air, the trial not yet finished, but her spirit unbroken. And in the defendant's glare, dark and simmering, it was clear. He knew the tide had turned. The seventh day of the trial dawned beneath a sky streaked with pale gold, sunlight filtering through the courthouse windows as though even the heavens were watching. The building hummed with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery filled quickly journalists, citizens, family members, all drawn to the unfolding drama. What began as a routine criminal case had become something larger, a story of innocence, courage, and justice. Inside the courtroom, silence pressed like a heavy curtain. The jurors filed in one by one, their faces set with gravity. They had witnessed every word, every gesture, every shred of evidence. Now the weight of responsibility hung visibly on their shoulders. At the prosecutor's table, confidence radiated in quiet restraint. His files were neatly stacked, his suit immaculate, his eyes clear and steady. He knew this was his final chance to thread the evidence into a single, undeniable story. Across the room, the defense attorney adjusted his tie with nervous fingers, whispering to his client in hushed, clipped tones. The defendant sat rigid, his expression fixed in an unnatural calm, as though carved in stone. But beneath that facade, a storm brewed, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the table. The judge entered, his robe sweeping behind him, and with a single rap of his gavel, the room came to order. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence. Today, you will hear the closing arguments before beginning your deliberations. Remember, arguments are not evidence. They are perspectives meant to guide your consideration. It is your duty to weigh the truth." With that, he nodded toward the prosecutor. "You may proceed." The prosecutor stood and moved deliberately to the center of the courtroom. For a moment, he simply looked at the jury, meeting each pair of eyes with calm assurance. Then he began. "Truth is not always loud. It does not always shout. Sometimes, truth comes in the quiet courage of a young woman who refuses to be silenced. Sometimes, truth comes from the innocence of a child who sees what adults try to complicate. And sometimes, truth is found in cold, hard evidence that cannot be denied." He gestured to the files on his table. Fingerprints, shoe prints, phone records, threats uttered in anger and fear. These are not stories. These are facts. And they point in one direction, only toward the defendant. His voice grew firmer, filling the courtroom. "You heard Sarah. You saw her courage as she stood here, and told you what happened, despite the weight of her fear. She had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And yet, she told the truth." He paused, his tone softening. "You also saw what happened when a little girl, just 3 years old, looked at her and said, 'It's okay. You can talk.' That was not rehearsed. That was not staged. That was humanity. And it reminded us all of something vital. The truth matters." He let the silence settle before continuing. "The defense will tell you this case is about doubt. They will try to distract you with speculation and character attacks. But doubt must be reasonable. And there is nothing reasonable about ignoring the overwhelming evidence before you." He turned, pointing directly at the defendant. This man thought he could intimidate, manipulate, and escape accountability. But he underestimated one thing: courage. Courage from Sarah. Courage from a child. Courage from every person who stood for truth in this courtroom. Now it is your turn. He walked back to his table, his voice dropping to a final, solemn note. "Do not let fear win. Deliver justice. The room was utterly still as he sat. Even the air seemed to hesitate. The jurors scribbled notes, their pens scratching like faint whispers against paper. Then, slowly, the defense attorney rose. His shoulders squared, his eyes flicked to the jury, and he began his counter-argument. Ladies and gentlemen, we all want justice. We all want truth. But justice cannot be served if we let emotion cloud our judgment. What you saw in this courtroom, while touching, while deeply human, was not evidence. A child's words, however sweet, cannot replace facts. He paced deliberately, his voice rising with practiced conviction. The prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple. But life is not simple. Memory can falter. Fear can exaggerate. Emotions can deceive. My client has sat here, insisting on his innocence. And what proof have you truly seen? Fingerprints? Shoe prints? Those can be misinterpreted. Phone records? Easily explained. What you have, ladies and gentlemen, is not certainty. It is assumption, dressed as fact. He stopped in front of the jury box, lowering his voice. You have a duty, a sacred duty. And that duty is to uphold the principle that it is better for 10 guilty men to go free than for one innocent man to be condemned. If there is doubt in your hearts, and I believe there must be, you cannot convict. His words dripped with urgency, with desperation disguised as logic. He gestured at Sarah, sitting quietly with Ranger at her side. She may believe what she says. I do not question her sincerity. But sincerity does not equal truth. People can be mistaken. And we cannot send a man to prison on feelings alone. He returned to his table, his face flushed, his movements sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Therefore, I ask you to return a verdict of not guilty. He sat, exhaling heavily, his hand trembling slightly as he poured himself a glass of water. The judge turned to the jury. You have heard the arguments. You will now retire to deliberate. Court is in recess until a verdict is reached. The gavel fell, and the tension broke like glass. The jurors filed out solemnly, their faces etched with thought. The gallery buzzed with low murmurs, the press already scribbling frantically. Melissa hugged Emily close, whispering, Almost. Done, sweetheart. But even she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from Ranger's steady presence. She had told her truth. Now it was in the hands of 12 strangers. The defendant leaned back in his chair, his lips twitching into a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. He whispered something to his attorney, who looked pale, sweat shining on his brow. As the jury door closed, silence reclaimed the room. Inside the deliberation chamber, the jurors took their seats around a long wooden table. They exchanged glances, their faces serious, their notebooks stacked thick with testimony and evidence. The foreperson, a woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, cleared her throat. All right, let's begin. Does anyone feel this case is unclear? Hands shifted. Some nodded with certainty. Others hesitated. One juror, a young man in a navy blazer, spoke first. The evidence feels strong. The prints, the records, the threats put together, it's convincing. But convincing isn't enough. Another countered. A middle-aged man with furrowed brows. We need to be sure. Beyond reasonable doubt. And the defense raised some valid points about memory and emotion. A third juror, a woman with glasses, shook her head. No, Sarah was consistent, and she had no reason to lie. Plus, the forensic evidence lines up perfectly with her account. The debate sparked, voices rising, then falling, each argument met with counter-argument. Hours stretched on, the weight of the decision pressing heavier with each passing moment. Outside, the courtroom waited. The prosecutor sat quietly, rereading his notes, though he knew every word by heart. The defense. Attorney paced, his movements restless. The defendant leaned back, smirking occasionally, though his eyes betrayed flickers of unease. And Emily, curled up against her mother's side, asked softly, "Why is it taking so long?" Melissa kissed her forehead. "Because they want to be very, very sure." The tension held, the courthouse suspended in breathless anticipation. The jury's voices behind closed doors grew muffled but urgent, the outcome uncertain. As dusk painted the windows in hues of amber and violet, the world outside moved on. But inside, the fate of one man and the courage of one woman hung, delicately in balance. The courthouse was silent, save for the faint ticking of the old clock mounted high above the gallery. Hours had passed since the jury had retreated to deliberate. Outside, night had crept over the city, draping the courthouse in shadows. Streetlights glowed faintly through the tall windows, their beams slanting across the wooden floors. The air inside remained tense, charged with anticipation so sharp it could almost be heard. Every soul in the courtroom waited. Journalists, hunched over notepads, their pens idle now, ready to explode into motion at the first hint of news. Families clutched one another's hands, their whispers barely audible. The defendant sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. Though his tapping foot betrayed nerves, he refused to acknowledge. His attorney leaned close, speaking softly, but the man waved him away with a sharp flick of his wrist. On the other side, Sarah sat with Ranger at her side. She stroked the police dog's fur slowly, drawing calm from his steady presence. Her face was pale, but her eyes were strong. Melissa sat nearby, holding Emily against her chest. The child had grown restless during the long wait, but the seriousness of the moment weighed even on her tiny shoulders. She clutched a small stuffed toy in one hand, her other arm draped protectively over Ranger's back. Suddenly, the heavy door to the jury room creaked open. Every head snapped toward it. The bailiff stepped inside and whispered something to the judge. The judge gave a solemn nod, then lifted his gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise. The jury has reached a verdict." The room exploded into motion people, scrambling to stand, breaths catching in collective suspense. The jurors filed in, one by one, their faces lined with exhaustion, but firm with purpose. They took their seats in silence. The foreperson, a woman with silver hair and steady eyes, held a folded slip of paper in her hand. The judge looked to her. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," she replied. "Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff." The bailiff carried the folded paper to the judge, who opened it, scanned its contents briefly, then nodded. His face betrayed nothing. He handed it back to the foreperson. "You may read the verdict." The foreperson rose, her voice calm but resonant in the tense room. "In the matter of the state versus Jonathan Kane, on the charge of felony assault and intimidation, we the jury find the defendant." The room seemed to stop breathing. Sarah's fingers tightened around Ranger's fur. Melissa clutched Emily closer. The defendant's lips curled into a faint, defiant smile. "Guilty." The word rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed. Some in the gallery whispered prayers of relief. The prosecutor closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded, his shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. Sarah's breath caught in her chest. She looked at the foreperson, then at the jurors, tears springing to her eyes. Relief flooded her face, not of triumph, but of release. Ranger pressed closer against her leg, as though sensing the weight that had just lifted from her shoulders. Emily tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Did we win?" Melissa smiled softly, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "Yes, sweetheart, we won." The defendant's chair screeched against the floor as he jumped to his feet. "This is a joke," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. His attorney tried to restrain him, hissing, "Sit down, Jonathan." But he shoved the chair aside, glaring at the jury. "You'll regret this, every one of you." The judge's gavel slammed down repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" The bailiffs rushed forward, seizing the defendant by the arms, restraining his wild flailing. He continued to scream, his face twisted in rage, but his words were drowned by the hammering of the gavel. Finally, the judge roared, "Mr. Kane, one more outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom permanently." The man struggled for another moment, then sagged in the bailiff's grip, his chest heaving. His glare still burned at Sarah, but it no longer held the power it once did. The verdict had stripped him of his control. When the room finally settled, the judge turned to the jury. "Members of the jury, on behalf of this court and the people of this state, I thank you for your service. Justice is never an easy duty, but it is a necessary one. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court." The jurors filed out, some glancing at Sarah with quiet nods of respect, others smiling faintly at little Emily, whose presence had touched them as deeply as the testimony itself. The judge then addressed the courtroom. "Sentencing will be scheduled within 30 days. Court is adjourned." He struck the gavel one final time. With that, the trial was over. The room buzzed with renewed energy. Journalists bolted for the doors, eager to break the news. Families embraced. Melissa hugged Sarah tightly, whispering, "It's over. You did it." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We did it. I couldn't have done this alone." Her gaze shifted to Emily, who stood proudly beside Ranger, her small hand resting gently on the dog's head. Reporters swarmed, microphones flashing, cameras snapping, but the officers quickly ushered Sarah and her family through a side door to spare them the chaos. They were led to a quiet conference room where they could breathe again. In that room, the prosecutor joined them, his expression softening. "You were remarkable," he said to Sarah. "Your courage carried this case. Without you, justice might not have been possible." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I was terrified." But when Emily spoke to Ranger, something in me shifted. I couldn't back down anymore. The prosecutor crouched to Emily's level, smiling warmly. "You know, young lady, you might be the bravest person in this whole courthouse." Emily beamed shyly, pressing her face against Ranger's fur. "I just wanted Sarah not to be scared." "Sometimes," the prosecutor said softly, "that's all it takes." Later that evening, as they stepped out into the cool night air, the courthouse glowing behind them, Sarah felt the weight finally lift. For weeks, she had carried fear like an anchor. Tonight, she breathed freely. Reporters still lingered outside, cameras flashing as they approached, but Sarah shielded Emily with her arm. Melissa guided them past the crowd, and Ranger walked steadfastly at their side, his presence commanding respect. "Sarah," one reporter shouted, "how does it feel to know the jury believed you?" Sarah paused, her voice clear and unwavering. "It feels like hope. It feels like fear didn't win." The crowd erupted in applause, though Sarah quickly moved forward, unwilling to linger in the spotlight. What mattered most wasn't headlines or cameras. It was safety, truth, and the knowledge that Emily's simple words had changed everything. At home that night, Emily curled into her bed, hugging her stuffed toy tightly. Melissa tucked her in, whispering, "You were amazing today." Emily yawned. "Did Ranger help too?" Melissa smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. Ranger helped a lot. But you gave Sarah the courage to speak. That's something no one will ever forget." Downstairs, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with Melissa, sipping tea. The quiet hum of the house contrasted sharply with the chaos of the courtroom. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future unshackled from fear. Ranger lay at her feet, his steady breathing filling the silence. She reached down, stroking his fur. "He's more than just a dog," she murmured. Melissa nodded. "And Emily's more than just a child." Together, they reminded us all of something powerful. Sarah exhaled, a small smile tugging at her lips. That even the smallest voice can change everything. The two women sat quietly, the weight of the day settling into something softer, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and fragile hope. The trial would be remembered by many as a battle of law and evidence. But for those who lived it, it would forever be something greater. The story of a child's innocence breaking through fear, of a police dog's silent strength, and of one woman's courage to face the truth. Justice had been served, but more than that, humanity had prevailed. And somewhere deep in her dreams that night, little Emily whispered again the words that had changed it all, words that would echo far. Beyond the walls of any courtroom, it's okay. You can talk.